there's an invitation to innovation in this moment that is extended to the church and to the church leaders. And if individuals are able to accept that invitation, I think there's a very hopeful future for the church. However, accepting that invitation requires taking a risk. And that's the challenge that leaders have to face, is whether or not they'll take the risk of innovation.
Welcome to Real Faith, Real World, where we connect the faith within us with the world around us. This podcast is a resource of World Methodist Evangelism, where we connect, equip, and encourage networks of Christian leaders to build faith-sharing movements around the world. My name is Rob Haynes. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the generosity of Christ Church Memphis for their continued support of this podcast. Many people have shared with me, wherever I may go, that they're concerned about the future of the church. They're concerned about declining attendance numbers or declines in giving. They're concerned about a culture that is less and less interested, it seems, in Christianity. But it also presents many opportunities for ministry. That's why we're launching this series called Innovating Church. This is going to be a series of conversations with thought leaders and practitioners who are doing great work in the areas of new ways of ministry or re-engaging with old ways and doing them in a context that is new and exciting. We're going to launch this with a discussion with the Reverend Dr. Dustin Bennick. Dustin is an assistant professor of practical theology at Truett Seminary at Baylor University in Texas, and he is the co-director of the program for the Future Church. Dustin, welcome to the Real Faith, Real World podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Tell us about yourself a little bit.
Sure. I am a visiting assistant professor of practical theology at Baylor's Truett Theological Seminary in Waco, Texas. I also co-direct a program here called the Program for the Future Church. And on my best days, Rob, I'm what I think about as an ecclesial innovator. Somebody who's trying to innovate in and for the good of the church.
Wow, yeah.
And all of that, I try to bend imagination towards hope. And I am glad to be here and hopeful about the church in this moment.
Well, Dustin, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I've always enjoyed our conversations and the different ways that our paths have crossed. And you going from North Carolina now to Baylor this time. Basketball is important in your life, I know.
I like to say that, Baylor got successively better once I got here, and Duke got marginally worse. So wow. I don't know if there's any correlation there, but please don't tell Coach K and don't tell Coach Scott Drew.
Well, yeah, I noticed that the theology followed and basketball, the tying in there together. So that's good. That's good to know. And
pick a school based on their basketball team.
That's exactly right. Well, you're doing some really interesting work in terms of the church and some new innovations. And we here at Real Faith, Real World are launching a series I'm calling Innovating Church.
That's good.
I think people are sometimes concerned about a decline in the church or people's increasing disinterest in religion, not only in the United States, but I've heard this around the world. I've heard this in India. I've heard this in the South Pacific and Europe and Africa and other places as well. So one of the things we want to talk about today is kind of how we got here. So one of your focuses has been on church innovations. And before we get too deep into that, what's wrong with the church? Why do we even need to talk about innovating church?
Yeah, that's good. I oftentimes like to begin this conversation by thinking about what's right, because that's one of the beautiful things here is that there's so much that is right about the church and so much good is in the space, and there's so much that's gives life and so much potential. So insofar as there's anything that's wrong with the church, I think it's that the church hasn't always recognized all the possibility that it has.
Oh, go on.
And our church leaders haven't recognized what is possible when they step outside of what they had previously imagined about what church is and what it could be, and take a chance. So I do all of this work out of a space of abundant care. Love the church, love church leaders. And the greatest thing that's wrong with the church is we haven't imagined all that the church could be and all that we could do together.
Wow, that's beautiful. Now, when you say church leaders, I'm pretty sure you mean not just pastors, not just the clergy. You're talking about all the different ways that people can serve in a church, right?
That's right. That's right. I think that's one of the beautiful things we actually see in this moment, Rob, is our imagination for what counts as a church leader is expanding beyond the single pastoral model. And don't get me wrong, we need good and thoughtful pastors, and I want to champion their work and come alongside them in every way I can. And yet we're seeing in this moment that there's an expanded range of ministerial vocations, faithful Christian witness, where people can do this work as a pastor. They can do it as a nonprofit leader. They can do it from the pews. They can do it as an entrepreneur in business. They can do it in a mental health professional. And these various expressions of ministry can all contribute to innovate in the church in various ways. And that's one of the things I hope we can talk about.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Well, I want to touch on one more thing, kind of the elephant in the room before we get to that. And that's where we are in the pandemic. So you and I are recording this in the first quarter of 2022. The lockdowns are easing in many places. The mandates are falling and that sort of thing. But the church is continuing to try to figure out, what do we do with the boxes that we open, the Pandora's boxes maybe that we even open, of things like virtual spaces. So, no one, the churches had no one online before the pandemic, and now they've committed to this online presence as they had to. And now they're trying to figure out, do we go back to that, or do we do something else, or how do we innovate in this space? Or, what about people who are still concerned about going out and that sort of thing? So all that to say, how has the pandemic impacted some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, the pandemic has only heightened and exacerbated so many things that we faced before the pandemic.
Yeah.
If I were to list a catalog of the various challenges that churches and faith leaders face, I'd say there are 10 pressing challenges.
Okay.
You may have been asking about this a little bit earlier when we were asking about what's wrong.
Yeah.
But I would point to 10 different challenges, and would love to provide a brief description there for your listeners.
Go for it.
The first one that I see is just the shifting structure of our denominations. We've heard about this for decades with mainline denominations, but for the faith leaders and communities of faith I listen to and talk to, it's not just mainlines.
Yeah.
Individuals across traditions are recognizing that the way we organize religious life is changing and has been changing for some time.
Let me stop you there right quick, Dustin. What do you mean when you say mainline?
Yeah, mainline. So let's think about kind of the big steeple churches that many of our communities have, at least in North America, on the street corner. Okay. So think about the big steeple Presbyterian church, the big steeple Methodist church, maybe even the big steeple Episcopal church that have historically been kind of key anchors in our community. Right. And there's also much smaller versions of that spread out throughout the countryside. So that's what I mean by mainline.
All right, great. Perfect. Thank you. Keep going.
Of course. And then there's also this kind of shifting pipeline for people who are trained in traditional theological education, people who go to seminary and get a seminary degree. So there's a shifting pipeline, and there's also a shifting trajectory where people who are trained are doing a broader range of things. And we talked about that earlier when we talked about there's more to ministry and innovation than just the single pastoral vocation.
Yeah, yeah.
The third challenge that I point to, Rob, is this contested place of Christianity in public life. This place of Christianity is changing. Some people in our communities think that's something to be grieved, where Christianity is being displaced from a prominent position. Right. And other people actually think that this is something to be celebrated, that there's more witness that can happen on the other side of Christendom. Yeah. I'm not trying to take sides here. I'm just trying to say that the place of Christianity in public life is changing. Right. And for our listeners beyond the States and beyond the West, this Christianity has oftentimes occupied a very different place in public life.
Yeah.
So we're here to learn from you. So those are the first three. Can I run through a few more if you have time?
Keep going.
The fourth one I will call is isolation and loneliness. There was the U.S. Surgeon General noted several years ago. His name is Vivek Murthy. He said that before the pandemic, we faced what he called a loneliness epidemic.
Yeah.
But we had a loneliness epidemic in this country where people were isolated and disconnected from each other. And I think this has only deepened in this pandemic time. Fifth is the challenge of polarization. We exist in a time where there's heightened polarization, not just politically, but there's this heightened civic discourse where we can't even talk to each other.
Yeah,
I've talked to several faith leaders who describe in this moment how there are people who are divided in their community along red and blue lines.
Right.
It's increasingly difficult to even get people together in the same room to listen to one another. So it's the challenge of polarization. And then there's sixth, this expression of kind of local expressions of distrust for our institutions.
Right.
We oftentimes hear this at a macro level, where we distrust our collective institutions. We distrust maybe big government. We distrust various agencies. We don't know if we can trust our various administrators. But I think for pastors and religious leaders, this is actually felt more acutely at the local level about decisions, if we can trust our local government officials. Can we trust our local nonprofit organizations? Can we trust the pastors in our communities? Should I volunteer on the PTO? Can I serve in my community? Can these institutional spaces be trusted?
I think it's really interesting.
Seventh challenge is partnership. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to say, if I can just jump in there, so much of that is not only just institutional things, but it's a matter of how we conduct life. So, for example, I don't have to call up someplace and have a taxi come out. I can connect directly with someone on a rideshare app, or and so all of these flattening of structures play into these feelings as well.
Exactly. I think you're exactly right.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a fundamental reshuffling.
Absolutely. This is brilliant. Keep going, Dustin.
Yeah, thanks. The seventh one I would name is partnership. This is both a challenge and also a real space of possibility. For many of the faith leaders and communities I've talked to over the past decade, partnership is a complex challenge. We need to partner together to get good work done. But partnership is oftentimes a sticky thing. It's difficult to figure out who I can trust, how we can work together. What are the spaces we can work together, and what are the spaces where we need to work separately? Partnership is a key challenge. Eighth, and this will likely not come as a surprise to you or your listeners, Rob, is the importance and complex of digital ministry. The church went digital in 2020, and it hasn't gone back in many ways. So digital ministry for many leaders is an ongoing challenge. Ninth is the challenge of financial practices and economics. The way we fund and resource our faith communities is changing in some fundamental and drastic ways. And so many faith leaders and communities, particularly when it gets to innovation, are coming up against some what we might call financial imagination about how they understand that work and the ways they fund their common life and various innovative practices. And the 10th one is this question of belonging. And more, I'm thinking that belonging might be the question of our era, where we're looking for spaces to belong, trying to decide to whom we belong. And in the wake of COVID and various other crises we face, trying to imagine what it means to belong to one another in this new age.
Dustin, I think it's important that we point out here too that yes, you're a scholar. Yes, you're a professor. Yes, you've read lots of books, but you're not getting this information from dusty books in a library somewhere in the basement. You've been on the ground. You have walked the halls of these churches, and you have talked to folks. And these are things that you're actively hearing from people, not just something that you're pulling out of thin air or out of some research paper somewhere.
I think that's exactly right. And I consider it a real privilege to listen to communities of faith and their leaders across the country and around the world. And I love nothing more than coming alongside faith leaders as they discern the next step in their work in ministry. And this work that I've talked about here has just come from walking church basements and wandering the streets of Seattle and being in the peanut fields of Atlanta, Georgia, and the backwoods of New England, and listening to local faith leaders in Waco and learning from my students.
Mm-hmm.
Everything I named here, there's stories tied to it. Yeah. It's not just abstraction. These are people's lives, and individuals in this moment face real crises, but they've also responded with abundant care, and that's really what gives me hope.
Yeah. I mean, because you used that term "practical theologian" a minute ago, and that can be something kind of out there and nebulous. But what we're talking about is just what you're saying. Our work, the work that you and I do in practical theology, is walking alongside people, real people who have real lives that are directly impacted. Right. I want to point that out too. So here you are. You've laid out the challenges. So what are the ways that that the church is innovating in these things? How can you help us kind of take a look at the landscape? If we were to, if you and I were sitting here looking at the Rocky Mountains or something like that, kind of paint the picture of the landscape for us on the ways that churches are meeting these challenges from your own experience and your own conversations.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, I would say there are a number of different ways churches and church leaders are responding to these challenges, and many of them are incredibly creative and really hopeful.
Yeah.
I'll keep returning to this theme throughout because listening to these faith leaders really gives me hope. The first way I would say is that they're actually reaching out in partnership. So one of the things we see in this moment is that in order to organize the life of faith, and get good work done in the community, many faith communities are recognizing that they need to partner with other people, other congregations, other organizations throughout their communities.
Yeah.
So one way people are innovating is they're reaching out and they're reaching across. And we're seeing that there's the formation of new partnerships that are happening in local communities. This is all local, Rob, where ministry happens at the local level. Right. So we're seeing individuals reach across in partnership. And this leads to a second form of innovation, is that after those partnerships are formed and trust has been built over the course of, honestly, sometimes decades. You talked about the pandemic a moment ago, and one of the things I think we want to note here is that the church has been innovative for a long time. Yeah. The pandemic wasn't the first time the church had to adapt.
That's true.
There's been a long history of innovation and adaptability that preceded the pandemic. And in fact, one of the things I saw when I talked to faith leaders in the wake of the pandemic is that those who had existing connections to partners beyond their particular sphere, they had more resilience in the wake of this uncertainty. Yeah. And they were able to be more nimble and adaptive because they had those existing partnerships in place.
Okay. Now,
that brings us to the go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
So that brings us to the second thing that I think is innovative, is there's actually the emergence of new organizational structures, new types of gathering that are emerging in the wake of this moment that are supporting these types of collaborative partnerships. Yeah. And I call these hubs. So hubs are these densely networked spaces. Think about the hub on a bike wheel. You've got that image with me? Yeah. It's this densely networked space where individuals from different parts of the community, and maybe even from different denominations, different congregations, different nonprofits, are meeting and mingling in response to the challenges they face. They're not trying to diminish their particularities. They're not trying to compromise any of the values that they have, but they're gathering around the challenges they face, the crises that they share, and exploring what does it look like to partner together in order to address those.
Okay.
So that's the second one I would name.
Yeah. So let's take a minute and look at the two of those together. So when you say partnerships, that can mean a lot of different things. And the things that I hear you talking about in terms of hubs and tying together, those don't simply solve the problems of putting more people in the pew on a Sunday morning. I hear you talking more about meeting the needs of the community, perhaps in mission or in speaking up in places where the church needs to have a voice in the public square more. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's good. Well, one of the things that I think is fascinating here is that there's actually an innovation in how we think about what the church is and what it's for. There is a certain understanding of the church and church life where it's a building where people come to and are gathered together in a particular setting. And there's a lot of value in that. I think that model of church life and ministry has very faithfully supported so many communities when churches were able to be anchors in their communities. It was a space of safe harbor where people could come and be gathered. But in this particular moment, I think the invitation is to think about the church with a little bit more porous boundaries and porous walls, where it is, yes, still a place where people are gathered together, and is still a place where people find deep and meaningful belonging. And it is also a space that can be a convening space where it can gather multiple people together from across the community. It can be a space that is an outreach space that is reaching across the community and service and mission. And it can also be a prophetic space where it's actually inviting the broader community to imagine new possibilities and forms of justice in light of the reality and possibilities of God.
Yeah. So can you give us an example or two of some of these partnerships that you've seen and how they've worked out?
Yeah, I've seen, so many different examples. I've seen partnerships between local congregations and nonprofits around matters of immigration, where local congregations and a nonprofit in Spokane, Washington, are gathering together in response to the immigration crisis that is confronting this country for right now, but also for a long time. And they're creating safe refuge for immigrants in their communities. They're partnering together to take the legal expertise of this nonprofit with the dense relational network of these congregations. And they're bringing these together to create spaces of hospitality, belonging, connection, and care. And one of the things that I think is really interesting and beautiful about this is this partnership isn't predicated or started because people are trying to get more people into their pews. They're engaging in this partnership for the sake of the common good, for the sake of the community, for the sake of the outcast. If that leads to more people in their pews, wonderful. But they're engaged in this partnership not because they're trying to support their congregational survival. They're engaged in this partnership to support people that they care about.
That may be the real rub right there, too, Dustin. That may be the real rub right there in terms of not just supporting your church budget or putting more people in the pews, which many people think just need to be there to support the church budget, but you're talking about actually engaging in mission of people's lives first.
Yeah. And that seems to be the priority for many of these innovators that I've studied, is that they have this restless discontent with the status quo.
Restless discontent with the status quo.
They have this deep care for faith communities and congregations. And yet, because they care so deeply about the future of the church, they're not willing to let the church stay as it is.
Yeah.
So they go and start nonprofits. They go and start social enterprises. They open up their buildings to be spaces of hospitality and hope.
Yeah.
They lead their communities in various forms of philanthropic partnership. They go serve on their local community organizing committee. The examples could just keep coming. But in each place, one of the things that I think is happening is that individuals are recognizing the challenges that exist outside of the church and trying to explore how the local church could be an agent of hope and healing for those challenges.
You were about to share a second story.
Oh, goodness. Another story about innovations. There's a whole host of stories that emerge around church buildings.
Yeah. Okay.
I did this collaborative work in the pandemic that came as a surprise, a book called Crisis and Care. And one of the things that we saw in this moment is that for so many faith communities, buildings became a real challenge, a real question.
Yeah.
When buildings are closed, what do we do with them? And buildings have been a challenge for many faith communities for some time, as we have older and aging buildings in many spaces. that have increasing maintenance costs. So many faith communities are trying to imagine what they actually do with their buildings.
Right.
So there are faith communities who are figuring out how to reimagine and repurpose their faith building, their congregations. And there are individuals who are trying to repurpose their buildings in ways that they're more porous. They're both worshiping centers, but also community centers.
Okay.
They're spaces that are multi-purpose and invite multiple people from the community into the building for the good of the community.
So what sort of things are they doing? Are you just talking about like holding Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, or maybe, they're going to let the community vote there on election day? Or are you talking about more dynamic things than that even?
Yeah, I think it's both. It's certainly kind of the everyday, and it's also the exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
They're opening their buildings to be public spaces. They're also reimagining and repurposing them. In some instances, they're actually social enterprises where they are income generating entities that are taking place in their church building, and that both allows the congregation to develop additional revenue, and also allows people from the community to participate in that faith community there.
So give me an example of what that would be.
Everything from hosting some type of exercise facility in your church building, mm-hmm. to co-working spaces, to repurposing a congregational facility as a coffee shop, a whole host of various options that are on the table there.
Yeah. And I'm sure that all of these churches have done the work they need to do for their tax status and all that kind of stuff. Yep. But these are ways that, I don't know, it seems like there is almost a sense of failure sometimes I hear from leaders if they use their church building for anything other than a worship service or a Bible study. Can you talk to that a little bit?
I think that raises a really important question here, is the question of loss.
Yeah.
So often we talk about innovation in terms of a possibility and potential. And there is the real possibility and potential when we talk about innovation. There's also a degree of loss. Mm-hmm. There's things that we need to grieve.
Yeah.
And it's different for each of these communities. Sometimes it's the loss of a particular assumption about what ministry looks like.
Yeah.
We had a particular vision and hope for what ministry might look like, mm-hmm. when we started out on this. And there's a need to grieve what is lost. For some faith communities, it's the loss of some type of collective identity, where we had an understanding of ourselves as a particular type of congregation. So there's a loss there. In some instances, particularly when we're thinking about partnership, there's the loss of autonomy. When you're no longer going alone, mm-hmm. then you have to make decisions in a different way. Mm-hmm. You have to consider other partners in the decision-making process. Yeah. You have to maybe move at a slower rate. There's real possibility there, don't get me wrong, but there's also real loss there as well. So I think the loss is real. And I think that's worth acknowledging and creating space for, and extending real care to these pastors and their communities in the midst of that loss.
On a future episode, we're going to talk about church restarts, pastors and leaders who go in and they celebrate all that happened in that church, and they close the doors with the leadership involved in the church. They close the doors of the church. There's a lot of rework that's done in terms of structure and everything from signage and branding and name and all that sort of thing. Still the same theology, still some of the same people, but then they treat it like a church plant. And so, we'll be talking about that sense of loss and how you manage that too. So if I am, if a pastor is listening now and saying, look, I get it. You're absolutely right, Dustin, but my people don't. I know the pastor says that we need to innovate, and there are lots of things that we need to do. But this brass plaque is right there on that one little thing that was somebody's great grandmother, named after her, and we can't, disrupt that, or we can't change the flow of what our week to week is like because people just aren't ready. They want to go back to what it was like in the 70s when they were kids, or something like that. But I know that it'll never go back that way. How do you start taking people to places where they don't want to go?
Yeah, that's good. That's a powerful and complex question. The first thing I would say is I think pastors and church leaders must always lead out of a posture of care.
Yeah.
Particularly in this moment when so many people and communities are just crisis weary.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's no substitute for being with our people out of a posture of abundant care. And I think that's always the first commitment I make to people when I work with them. And that's also the first thing I invite leaders to imagine as they're trying to imagine change. Is you can't lead your people beyond the connection that they have with you.
Yeah.
So the first thing I would say is the importance of care.
Okay.
The second thing I would say is once people feel like they have connection and care, then you can begin imagining a range of possibilities. And the first thing I would say is listen attentively to the complexities in your community. Mm-hmm. Because even though there may be this fixed structure that might be resistant to change in some form, there might also be pockets of complexity. There might be people in your midst who are more open and hospitable to this idea. They're just waiting for an invitation.
Oh, wow.
So become an excellent student of your context and of your community.
Yeah.
Listen deeply and attentively. The next thing I'd say is learn the power of questions.
Okay.
Because questions, particularly in an environment where people initially may seem to be hesitant to innovate, can invite people to imagine new possibilities.
Yeah.
When somebody in our congregation might just react to a suggestion that we should do something new, rather than responding in a way that is either dismissive or defensive, because I feel it personally.
Yeah.
What if we just asked a question that invited wonder? And I've seen time and time again when communities learn to cultivate this practice of powerful questions, it opens up new imaginative possibility.
Right.
So those would all be forms of innovation that I would describe as innovations of connection and care. I think there's also forms of innovation that you might call catalytic and somewhat disruptive.
Okay.
So I'll describe a few of these as well.
Yeah, please.
If you're trying to innovate and there's a resistance to this in your community, we know that congregations are much like ecological systems.
Okay.
They respond when you put something new in that system. So one of the things that you could try to do is you could try to put some new personnel in that system. You could hire somebody new who will disrupt the status quo. Make sure you give them the right support, the right safety, the right security, but invite them to be an innovator. You might not be able to be the innovator because of your particular position or history in the organization, but you can hire somebody new and ensure that they have the right support, the right protection, the right resources, and then commission them and protect them to be an innovator in your congregation. The other thing you can do that can be disruptive is actually you go and start something new.
Okay.
So if new personnel can be catalytic and disruptive in an organization that's resistant, new programs and new ideas and new initiatives can be catalytic and disruptive as well. So consider starting something new, expecting that you'll get some pushback. It doesn't have to be in this protected space, the space where nobody wants to change anything, but go somewhere slightly outside of that or beyond it. Innovate in a way where you feel like you have the latitude, the permission, still expect some disruption, still expect some resistance, but you'll learn something in that innovation that can then can change the way people in your community might think about the work of innovation, and you can do some learning together throughout that work. And then the final thing I'll say is reach out in partnership, because even if you might not be able to innovate in your context, you might be able to find a partner, whether it's another congregation, another nonprofit, maybe a consultant who can help you do that. And there is incredible value in having an outside voice and an outside perspective who can help do the catalytic, innovative work in your context.
So the things I hear you talking about, you don't mean disruption as a negative term. You're talking about something that can initiate positive change. Is that right?
That's right. It's really hopeful. I think that faith leaders lead and serve their communities out of an abundance of care.
Yeah.
Those who are called to this work do it because they care deeply for our people.
Yeah.
These are our people that we have served alongside, that we love, that have invested in our lives and in our family for many, many years. So we lead out of an abundance of care. And precisely because of that care, we try to innovate in ways that support our community into the future.
Yeah. Okay, so let's put on another hat. If someone's listening now and says, "Look, I'm just somebody who loves my church. I maybe teach a Bible study or lead the youth or something like that. I'm not a pastor, but I'm really serious about this, and my pastor's not so enthusiastic about these kind of changes. How do I start innovating in places like that if I don't have that power of the pulpit, if you will?"
Yeah, that's a real challenge. I appreciate that. The first thing I'd say to those listeners, know that you're seen and heard and valued.
Wow.
I know there is a real challenge of feeling unseen, maybe feeling alone when you care deeply about your community and want to see innovation positively affect your community. But don't feel like that vision is always shared. So I'll just talk to those people real directly and say you're valued.
Wow.
Your community needs you, even if they don't recognize it in this moment. More concretely, I'd say keep showing up. Keep showing up. Your congregation needs you. Your community needs you. And they need you to be in that space. And you need to develop trust simply by showing up. There's no substitute for showing up.
Right.
The second thing I would say is lean into the power of convening. Because even if you may lack the formal authority to preach on Sunday mornings or the formal authority to approve a budget, you do have the power to convene. And convening is an incredibly powerful act that can cultivate collective power and collective imagination. And when collective power and collective imagination coalesce around a shared vision for innovation, that can be a catalyst for not just disruption, but innovation that can enrich the broader community in some dynamic ways.
Okay.
And the final thing I would say is reach out to others. Reach out to others and figure out ways you might be able to bring other people from outside your congregation into that congregation in ways that they can be catalysts there. Sometimes that's a text. Hand your pastor a text that you think would be helpful for them. I can make a number of suggestions to Rob if that would be helpful. Maybe bring individuals in from outside of your congregation as guest speakers, consultants, whatever it may be, to just come alongside you and your congregation right where you are to help your congregation take the first step. You don't have to take 100 steps. You just have to take the first step. And sometimes you need somebody from the outside to help you do that work.
That's a good point. You don't have to take all the steps today, just the first one.
Right.
Okay, so Dustin, we're trying to look at the landscape here, and there's all kinds of things going on. There's things like fresh expressions, which we're going to talk about in a future episode, where people are starting faith communities in libraries and coffee shops and cycling groups on Sunday mornings and that kind of stuff. And other people are, as you said, using their church for different things, or there's all kinds of things that could be done. Multi-campus churches, we'll talk about that on future episodes as well. So what if someone's asking, which one do I do first, Dustin? Do I get skinny jeans and smoke machines on Sunday mornings, and that means people are going to come? Or do I start a worship service in the skate park, or do I go down to the trailer park and cook hot dogs for them? Which one's right? Which one do I do?
Yeah, that's good. That's powerful. I know there's a certain sense when we're talking about innovation that it can almost be paralyzing because it seems like there's so many possibilities.
Exactly.
If we're trying to think about innovation outside of the conventional, The conventional is helpful because it gives us a template to work with, and that can oftentimes be comfortable, and it gives us some space to work in. But when we reach beyond that, it can almost be paralyzed because we're not quite sure what to do or where to turn.
Right.
And in those instances, I invite people to do three things.
Okay.
One, think about where you are. Be real clear about that. Where are you? Where are you placed? Because one of the things that we see about innovation is that innovation is oftentimes placed, particularly church innovation. It takes place seriously and particularity seriously. It's not trying to innovate in abstraction. It's trying to innovate in a particular place.
Okay.
So become a student of your place. Learn to care deeply about your place. Learn who your neighbors are or who the neighbors of your church are.
Yeah.
Think about your place.
Yeah. Okay.
The second thing I would say is cultivate and protect a practice of listening. Many church innovators do not always have the luxury of patience to listen. They don't always have the opportunity to take a year or two just to listen to their community.
Right.
But whatever space you can have and whatever time you can protect, give yourself the freedom not to rush into the first step of doing something, but rather recognize that the first step is really listening right where you are and discerning the needs of that particular community and your particular team that surrounds you and the gifts of your particular team.
Yeah.
And then the third thing I would say is look for templates. Look for examples of innovation that seem to resonate with your understanding of your place and your growing understanding of the needs of that place, your discernment after that listening period. And then if you can find templates, you can begin to work around one potential model and develop your church innovation in a way that it's something like this.
Okay.
You don't want to work towards an identical match because that place and the complexities of that place aren't identical to yours. But if you can have a template to work with, you can work towards something that is simply like that.
Yeah.
And then the fourth thing I say, Rob, is just take the first step and figure out how to fail fast. You don't have to get it right. You're not going to get it right.
Right.
It's like solving a puzzle. You can't figure it out the first time.
Right.
But you just want to take the first step, take a risk, try something new, make a mistake, make lots of mistakes, and then figure out how to learn from those mistakes as you're innovating and moving forward together.
So mistakes can be beneficial. You're saying it's okay to take a step and fail.
It's wonderful to take a step and fail. It's wonderful to take a step because here's the thing: you'll learn from that mistake.
Yeah.
You'll be freed from the fear of mistakes, and then you'll be released to go try something new. Wow. I think that's one of the greatest things that can hold us back as we're thinking about innovation is not innovating at all because we're afraid to fail.
Yeah.
And that will first prevent us from making any mistakes, but it'll also prevent us from trying anything at all.
Yeah.
And I think the invitation to the church in this moment is to take some risks, to make some mistakes, and then to learn from those mistakes in an abundance of care.
Wow. Dustin, I think that's a great place to leave it. Now, before we let you go, I know that you do have a new work coming up called Just That Crisis and Care, and I want to have you back on a future episode to talk about that. You're in the later stages of getting that ready for publication, right? In a few months?
So that book is actually already available. It's called Crisis and Care, Meditations on Faith and Philanthropy.
Excellent.
I do have another book coming out this August called Adaptive Church, and would be happy to talk about that as well.
Yeah.
So if folks are interested in hearing stories of innovation, particularly in the wake of the pandemic,
right?
Crisis and Care is a collection of essays from some of the most creative church innovators I know around the country and around the world. I've been very fortunate to learn from them. Yeah. And then Adaptive Church will tell a number of stories of where innovation is happening and give some more conceptual and theological tools for for folks to hang on.
Perfect. Yes, we will get you on to talk about that before Adaptive Church comes out in August. That would be wonderful. So if someone wanted to know more about these things that you're talking about, crisis and care and adaptive churches, how could they get in touch? What's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, that's great. You can find me online, dustindbennick.org. And then you can also find me on Twitter at dustindbennick. Feel free to look up the Program of the Future Church, follow us and follow our work. And please don't hesitate to reach out. Like I've said several times, I love nothing more than walking alongside faith communities and their leaders and supporting people as they take the next step. So be delighted to learn from you and learn from the good work folks are doing around the world here.
Excellent. And we'll put links to all of that in today's show notes. Dustin, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your insights on how we can be a very innovating church.
Thank you, Rob. It's been a pleasure. Always good to see you, my friend.
You too. I love the fact that Dustin gives us permission and encourages us to take risks, so that failure is not something that holds us back, but to go forward as the Spirit has called us and let God do the work. I love the idea of taking the first step and not worrying about taking all 100 of them. You'll definitely want to go ahead and subscribe to the podcast now if you haven't already. You will not want to miss any of these episodes. We're going to have lots of conversations with folks who are doing work in some really innovative ways, as we mentioned a little bit in this discussion. Some of that is going to be in fresh expressions of ministry, and if you're not familiar with that, you'll definitely want to tune into that episode. We'll be talking about church planning, about multiple campuses, about virtual spaces, about even restarting churches, shutting them down and then restarting them. It's some really interesting things that are going on around the world, and I really encourage you to be here for those discussions. If you live in Europe and you're interested in these types of church innovations, and you are someone who is 18 to 35 who's interested in further Christian ministry, either lay or ordained, I want to encourage you to go to our website, worldmethodist.org, to check out the information on Metanoia Europe 2022. That's going to be the 29th of August through the 4th of September in Durham in the UK. That is going to be a great time to learn how you can take ministry to the next level and connect with others who want to do the same. You'll find all that information on our website, worldmethodist.org. Let us hear from you. We'd love to hear your comments, suggestions, or questions. If you want to get in touch with us about how you can be involved in ministry in these ways as well, write to us at podcast@worldmethodist.org. In today's show notes, you'll find links to all the things that Dustin and I discussed, as well as our social media connections. Well, my thanks again to Dustin Bennick, and thank you for listening. My name is Rob Haynes, and this is Real Faith, Real World.